and wonderful to see such a lot of people lurking there virtually. Quite exciting to bring you all together. I guess what I'm going to do is something quite different. And I hope that it will stimulate you. I hope that it'll inspire you. But it's very much plugged into the sustainability goals, but in particular, the Visit Cornwall Carbon Challenge, which I'm going to say a bit more about. So let me kick off with just a little bit about me. I'm not a climate scientist, so why you say, why am I purporting to talk about climate change? Well, actually, I'm an organizational psychologist by background. So I'm approaching this whole issue of carbon action and climate action from a rather different perspective. I'm also a climate doer. I don't call myself an activist because that's associated, it's got quite a lot of negative elements associated with it, but I have spent the past 12 years really working hard on reducing my own personal carbon footprint pretty substantially, triggered by my son, who did a renewable energy degree some 12 years ago at Camborne College. And he's been my sort of prod, if you like. But I guess also because my background was as a management writer and communicator. I've worked in business schools and I've been a freelance consultant, and I've done a lot of work in the management of change. So I found myself almost by accident writing a book, in fact, a manual called the Carbon Buddy Manual, Your Practical Guide to Cooling Our Planet. And my mission in all of the books that I've written has been to take complex subjects and to try to make them understandable, to be simple, but not to be simplistic, if you like, and trying not to dumb it down. Quick overview of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to give just a quick overview of where we're at globally with the climate response. I want to look at the heart of the current challenge. I'm going to try and focus the current challenge facing humanity as I see it. And then I want to bring it much more closer to home to start focusing on the unique role that you as a group have, I believe, as climate key workers. I'll say a bit more about that. And then float some early ideas about how Visit Cornwall can support you in that particular thing. So let's have a look first of all at some of the good news, and there is quite a lot of good news around climate action. The first thing is that solutions do exist. There's been a very interesting and deep study done in the States by an organization called Drawdown. Some of you may have come across it, which basically shows a huge raft of existing ideas, technologies which are workable, which are proven, and which can start to make a difference to carbon footprints. So that bit I think is well underway. You may want to argue with this, but the political will around the world is increasing, let's say. It's patchy, it has its ups and downs, it gets diverted by things, but it's on the agenda in a way that it certainly wasn't when I started my journey 10 years ago. Likewise, international cooperation, the IPCC, that's the International Panel on Climate Change, which is a UN body essentially, has been an extraordinary exercise in international cooperation, and also in the development and the implementation of aspects of solutions and research and stuff. There's a huge amount of international cooperation going on. Again, patchy, but let's celebrate what is working and what can be built on. One of the most dramatic changes in the last, I would say even the last 2 to 3 years, is what's happening in the financial world. I spoke to an independent financial advisor literally 2 years ago, and I said, where are we going to get the money for all this green technology and all the development that's needed? And he said, oh, the money's all there, it's just in the wrong places. And what we've seen or begun to see is a huge shift in the money going from the wrong places to the right places. Again, patchy, we're in transition, and things in transitions are always a bit up and down. You don't get total consistency. And kind of linked to that is a huge development in business innovation, in research and development. Some really exciting things happening as a young generation of very bright people take on the challenges thrown up by this existential challenge that we all face. And then there's a last one, which is very crucial, which is the mass mobilization of individual citizens. And this brings it back down to people like you and me. And what we're finding is that compared with a few years ago, more and more people are now saying that responding to climate change is important and is, either at the top of or near the top of their list of things that concern them. But there's a big but, and this is really the not so good news. It's encapsulated in this chart. Don't bother about trying to take in the detail of it. Research done by the Pew Research Center in the States, this was last year, very respected survey organization. And all you need to really think about is, look, round about 70% of people are saying climate should be the top priority to ensure a sustainable planet for future generations. So a pretty high rate of agreement with that, although variation amongst the different generations. But then look at this right-hand side here. What percentage of you have actually taken action to help address climate change within the last year, bringing it down to very concrete things? And look, we shoot way down to the highest 32%, which is the Gen Zs, who are the younger generation, who clearly are, by definition, are highly motivated, down to a paltry 21% amongst my generation, the baby boomers. So that is a rather stark set of figures, I find. And just to make everything even more challenging, distractions over the last few years, this series of global distractions that have taken our mind off the ball. So we had Brexit, the pandemic, the cost of living crisis, the energy crisis, and just as we thought we were coming through all of that lot, we now have war. And all of those things psychologically have the effect of making it more difficult in what is already a very difficult area, but making it more difficult for people to really focus on what is needed. So in a sense, back in 2020, the IPCC dubbed this the critical decade. It was the decade within which we had to get to the point where we were beginning to see substantial reductions in the amount of carbon and the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that we were spewing into the atmosphere. And so it was always a race against time, because the complexity of what has to be done, the transition time involved, i.e. how long it takes to do these things, was slipping away. But we've in a sense lost 2 years because of all of those distractions. And I suspect that even this year, we may kind of lose because we're finding it difficult to focus. But the net effect of that is quite stark. It means we have a bigger hill to climb than we would have done at the beginning, and we have less time in which to climb that. And that is a very uncomfortable place to be. And what it says is that business as usual, the way that we've been trying to influence people to engage with this issue, to turn those good intentions, i.e. we think it's terribly important, into practical action themselves. We've tended to do that by publishing research, by issuing dire warnings, by giving all the statistics, by publishing lots of books, newspaper articles. but it actually has got, I think, to the point where many people are kind of switching off, and there's a danger of people switching off. You know, we know during the pandemic that when the news is just unrelentingly about one thing, there's a tendency for people to switch off. So the stark message is that we need big results. We need really big results. And I'll say what I mean by results soon. And we need them soon. And my contention is that that's going to require a very different mindset and a ruthless focus in terms of how we go about this. So let me talk about focus first of all. The main threat is very stark and very clear. The existential threat is the continuing to pump greenhouse gas into the atmosphere. That is the thing that is the driver of climate change, global warming, whatever you want to call it, global heating. It is that continuing to do that. During the pandemic, those emissions started to decline, but since the pandemic, they've gone shooting up again because of all those deprivations that we faced. People perhaps saying, quite understandably, now we can actually get back to normal. Well, normal ain't going to be any good any longer. So the goal, if you like, is to be able to make rapid and substantial emissions reductions. And the second aspect of this is about speed. I can't stress enough this fact of the importance of these lost years. The more years we lose in terms of action, the steeper the hill, and therefore the faster we have to go to catch up. And speed has a number of different components to it. First of all, it's what I call the big ones. It's all about those actions that have the greatest short-term impact on your personal pollution. And in my book, I talk about personal pollution rather than carbon footprints. I'm trying to make it a bit more sort of bringing it back home, because we are, by virtue of all the things we do and that we buy, we are the polluters as consumers. And focusing on those actions that we can take which will have the quickest and the biggest impact in the short term on reducing our personal pollution seems to be absolutely at the heart of this. And there's a slight sort of warning here, and it's a difficult warning to say, is that in the language that gets used, we often mix up environmental and climate. People will often say, well, you know, I'm doing all sorts of environmental things, believing that they are actually having an impact on reducing their personal pollution or their carbon footprints. And that's not always necessarily so. So I think we just have to be a little bit more hard-headed about focusing on where we can reduce our carbon footprints. But then there's this issue of doing it now, the other aspect of speed, not only doing those right things, but doing them now. And we all know, you know, any of us who tried to diet, for example, you know, diet is something that you put off. And taking action on climate change is a little bit like that. You know, you've got to find your resolve. You've got to find the reason for doing it. And you've got to find ways around all of those distractions, all of those things that make you procrastinate. And I find so many people who say, yeah, I'll get around to doing that later. And what I'm saying now is that later is too late. Later is too late. And that's an uncomfortable truth that we have to face up to. So that's to do with speed, but I also want to talk about scale. That phrase I used earlier, the massive mobilization of individual citizens. It's very interesting that a lot of research money, a lot of government money has gone into technological solutions, a lot of business Investment is going into technological solutions. A lot of money is now going into trying to find, to channel money into the right places. But the one big area that seems to be receiving very little attention is what I call the human problem. Because at root, if we as human beings can't find that resolve and start to act with the degree of urgency that is required and to do the big things that need doing, then we become, in a sense, the root of the problem. We can have all the new solutions, all the new technologies, all the new money, but if we as human beings don't actually pull out our finger and do things and do them quickly, then we've got a problem. And I think this psychological aspect, and I would say this, wouldn't I, being a psychologist, but this psychological aspect is important because what we know is that one of the key drivers of change, one of the things that makes individuals change their behavior is seeing other people change their behavior. That is a prime lever, if you like, which we know works. We are social animals. We are driven by what other people, we think of other people and what other people think of us. But equally, at a more cultural level, we have a degree of inhibition, quite understandable inhibition, about talking about some of these difficult kinds of subjects, particularly where we feel we're struggling, or where we feel we don't understand them, or where we feel that other people are going to give us a hard time if we start talking about them. So, having painted that bigger picture, and I hope given you a sense of the key focus going forward, let's bring it down to you as an audience. I'm using this phrase, frontline climate workers, because just like in the pandemic, we became aware of the importance of key workers in the health service and elsewhere. I think by calling all of us frontline climate workers, it perhaps begins to communicate the importance of what we as individuals can do individually, but importantly, obviously, the accumulation of what we do individually. And I want to look a little bit at doing the right stuff yourselves and also inspiring others to follow your example, because we know that by doing things yourself and then talking about it to other people and letting other people see what you're doing, that is one of the ways of driving scale and behavior change on that more massive scale. And you, in Cornwall, in the hospitality and tourism industry, with I think it's 4 million visitors coming to the county each year, are in a unique position to help to create some of this big impact that I'm talking about. Mahatma Gandhi put this very well. He said, in order to make people change, we the people have to be the change. And that takes me on then to the ideas that lie behind the Visit Cornwall Carbon Challenge. And I think why Malcolm approached me to see if I could help to articulate a way in which you could beef up the Visit Cornwall initiatives around the reduction of carbon footprints, very specifically. And as we talked, it became clear that trying to mobilize you as a group, all the businesses that belong and the organizations that belong to Visit Cornwall, and also through those people who in turn interact with the visitors coming into the county, we have a huge leverage effect that could be possible. So I think within that, I see two main challenges. Challenge one, it's been easy so far for individual consumers. And the reason I say that is that most of the progress that's been made, most of the attention that has been done has been at the level of governments and businesses. The UK in particular has made huge strides, for example, in its renewable energy program, particularly offshore wind, which has made a big impact in terms of reducing the carbon generated at source. But we're getting to the stage now where those big national or international type wins are getting more difficult to make, although you might argue that post the Ukraine situation, that it's getting more difficult to do that. So I think at an individual level, we're having to look at scaling up the ambition. And I'm going to try and put this into words for you. What do I mean by scaling up the ambition? A lot of work I did in my early career was with high-performing teams where we talked about stretch targets. And I'm going to just float this as my attempt to make very concrete the sort of thing we might be talking about. Can you envisage cutting your personal and business greenhouse gas emissions by 50% within the next 5 years, and then going further? I can't tell you a figure that you've got to get to, but I would have thought, you know, for most of us, we've got to think in terms of reducing our direct carbon emissions, probably down to 0. And you know, when you think of this word net zero, most people don't understand what it means, and even I have difficulty with that, I have to say. But there's a heck of a long way to go in a relatively short space of time. So this boldness of ambition, I think, is crucially important. And then the second element of this goal: inspire 25% of your guests each year to go away and do the same, and then go further. And a friend of mine said, you know I ought to be saying things to other people, talking to other people about what I'm doing, and I realize I lack the courage to do that. And I think that is actually very well put. It requires this concept of courage. Where do we find our courage to try to see and try to influence other people to do things as well as to do things by ourselves? But I think the key thing, one of the ways we discover our courage, is to feel that we're not alone, that we're part of something bigger. And there are 3 things that I think are on offer, which at least can begin to provide you with support as you go into that. 3 practical tools. The first is the Carbon Buddy Manual. It's a very practical book. It's a book you don't read so much. Thank you, Charlotte. It's not so much a book you read, it's a book you use. You write in it, you fill in charts, you know, it's a hands-on type of thing, and it leads you through a process, a step-by-step process, to help make what to most people is a fiendishly and overwhelmingly complex issue, but to break it down into bite-sized chunks to make it manageable. And I'm not sure quite where it's at, but I know that Malcolm plans for many of you to receive a free copy of the Carbon Buddy Manual. I think the plan was that once you paid your subscriptions, you would get your copy. So there are certainly some free copies out there. And then obviously, if they run out, then there are copies that can be bought. My second thing is I want to draw your attention to this website, Climate Outreach. Climate Outreach have done some fantastic work in looking at how you have conversations with people about climate change. They're difficult conversations, let's not beat about the bush, and many people will shy away from them. But they've done some really great research and turned it into a very practical, usable set of tools to give you some simple strategies for talking with other people in a non-threatening way, making it a friendly conversation, but at the same time, not ducking the fact that you're trying to excite other people about it. You're not going to lecture them, you're not going to threaten them, you're not going to judge them. But I find, paradoxically, although this thing is huge and overwhelming, I think it is potentially one of the most exciting things that the world has ever done. And if the world can do it at scale and at speed, in the way that we got excited with the Kate Bingham team who developed the vaccine and got the vaccines. And, you know, that was an example of when humans do cooperate, how extraordinary we can be in doing things. And then the final thing is a sort of a, in the manual, we talk about carbon buddy groups. I found that people gain momentum and support and purpose by doing this sometimes with other people. That's really the origin of the idea of the carbon buddy. But you can form carbon buddy groups. And I think as a network of businesses and people, you have a terrific opportunity to form little relationships, little subgroups, just to work on this together. Use the manual, walk your way through it over the space, you know, maybe meet once a month or something and decide to take a certain topic or a certain step in the manual. And it gives you some tips about how to make those little groups work. Don't do it alone. Use the resources and the skill and the experience, swap ideas with each other. And perhaps that could be formalized as a flagship project, but perhaps equally, it could just be done as a very simple, informal thing. So very quickly, time is short. We have to discover our resolve. I hope that you could feel that through this, you could feel more confident, more focused, more ambitious, and more courageous. And I hope that you would discover a clear sense of purpose, because that is being clear about your sense of purpose and what lies behind it is what gives you that initial kickstart to get it going. And it's not about the planet, actually. The planet will be fine. In fact, the planet will be even better with no human beings in it. I believe it's about future generations. And Mary Robinson, the ex-president of Ireland, who's also a global climate ambassador recently, I thought put it very well and very emotionally. She said, if we don't act, our children and our grandchildren will have no future. It's as bad as that. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Colin, very much. Has anybody got any questions for Colin?
I've got a couple here. If anyone else has got any, please go ahead. If not, I can go ahead. All right. It says you mentioned the big ones, the actions with the biggest carbon reduction impact. Which ones do you think are the most important for hospitality industry to be concentrating on?
I was hoping I could avoid that one. In a sense, I try not to give advice to people. And the reason I don't give advice is because each person's situation is unique. And I'm wary of giving sort of generic answers. But I think in the case of the hospitality industry, I could perhaps flag some areas that are likely to be of importance. It's only once you've actually measured your carbon footprint, which is what one of the things that the manual helps you to do, that you can begin to see which are the priority areas, which are the biggest contributors. But let me just flag some that I think clearly are of relevance in your industry. Food sourcing. Particularly food miles, particularly using food that comes from the other side of the world. I think that is one thing that is a challenge to chefs, a challenge to menu planners, a challenge in all sorts of ways. Event. Sorry about that. That's telling me I've talked for too long. Events, weddings, conferences, they tend to be highly polluting events. If you look at 200 people coming to a wedding, or whatever, particularly if they've flown, which I suppose won't be the case so much if they come down here. But I do think that there's a sort of unique product offering of the, I don't know what you'd call it, the low carbon wedding, the low carbon conference, where you really think through not only what you as the provider are doing, but you try to incentivize the people coming to the event or coming to the wedding to do the right thing. And you make it easy for them. You give them little checklists, or I don't quite know how you would do it. So events would be a second thing. Fossil fueled cooking and fossil fueled heating. I know that a lot of establishments cook on gas. I don't know a lot about that in detail, but ultimately, probably cooking has to go electric, and it has to go green electric. So that's a transition. It's a complicated one, probably an expensive one, but better start thinking about that sooner rather than later. Heating of homes, hotels, B&Bs, particularly if you're heating using oil, is a massive, massive challenge. And it's not a simple one because it encompasses so many different things: insulation of the places in the first place, retrofitting of insulation, ultimately possibly moving towards air source heat pumps rather than boilers. And that's a biggie. And also perhaps, having to educate your clientele that having a hotel room or a B&B at 22 degrees is not very planet friendly, and that maybe actually they need to think about coming on holiday, particularly if you're going towards more winter holidays, and being happy with 19 degrees and bringing warm clothes. So I think that's enough on that just for the mo.
Okay. One other question. What's the biggest obstacle you see to beating global warming?
Human beings.
Yes.
Human psychology. I'll have the analogy with dieting again. We say we want to do things, but then we don't actually do them, or we find them very difficult, or we start doing them, and then we kind of
phase out. Yeah.
We fade out, and this is going to require us to do things consistently over a long period of time. It's not a very exciting, well, it is an exciting prospect once you get going, once you get into it, because you get the sense of purpose that comes from it.
And the final,
some of our habits.
The final question is, why should we be reducing our carbon footprint when China continues to pollute by burning coal?
China is a complicated one. It's very easy to stereotype China and India and possibly the States as being big, particularly coal. It gets done around coal. And it's going to get more difficult now if there's pressure to rely on coal for longer. But China has been on a trajectory of increase in renewables over many years, way outstripping anything that more or less any other country has done. So the proportion of their energy being created from renewable energy has been going up at a very steep level. And China has been responsible for the mass production and the mass market in solar panels particularly, which has brought the cost of solar panels down dramatically over the years. Without China's technological know-how and their huge markets, the cost of solar panels probably wouldn't have come down. They're about to do the same thing with batteries for powering electric cars and buses and trains, etc. So, you know, there's a lot of very important stuff happening in China. A lot of green technologies that really are being led from there. But I think the other aspect of China that we all have to think about is look at the next 10 or 20 items that you buy and look at how many of them are made in China. If you want China to produce less carbon emissions, then buy less stuff from China. We are partly responsible for the fact that China has those high emissions and continues to have those high emissions because they're making stuff for us. And so we have to think about how we can change our behavior or whether we manufacture things closer to home or whatever. That process may have started anyway, but we will see. So it's a mixed picture, China. I don't buy vilifying them because they're doing a lot of plus things as well, but clearly they're part of this international push.